Dr. Paul Hutchison.
It's a pleasure to take a call on the State Sector and Public Services Reform Bill, and what a sorry diatribe from Mr Williams in New Zealand First. How sad it is that they are not supporting this very enlightened bill, because after all, it is 100 years that we are celebrating of an excellent public service in New Zealand, and indeed a country can be judged on the integrity, efficiency and effectiveness of its public service, and here the national government in true leadership form is once again ensuring that we have a state sector that is modern, flexible and generally fit for purpose. And Mr Speaker, I was delighted to see in the Part 3 amendments to the Crown Entities Act 2004 that collaboration... I don't know what he's talking about, Mr Speaker. It seems utterly irrelevant, like New Zealand First's contribution to this debate is about. But, Mr Speaker, the last thing I wanted to mention was collaboration between the various public entities, and indeed that's vital as we see the various whole-of-government approaches to matters such as the White Paper on children in New Zealand. This is an excellent bill, and I indeed support it.
Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, as David Cunliffe has already indicated to the House, the Labour Party is supporting these three bills because we think that it's important in respect of cornerstone legislation that governs the state sector that it is desirable if at least the two major parties can reach agreement. It is largely housekeeping legislation, and it's important that we have stability in our state sector. Indeed, I thought it was appropriate time to have a bit of a reflection on history. The Act that this amends is a 1988 Act that was passed by the Longy government under the ministerial direction of the Honourable Stan Rogers. Lost his membership from the PSA for a while thereafter, so it wasn't all roses for him. But it is somewhat interesting to reflect on the fact that only 30 years ago we had far less sophisticated both public finances and state sector than we now have. Indeed, it wasn't until that government reformed the reporting of accounting information from government departments that we moved to true accrual accounting across government. Until then, there was dishonesty in the government accounts of the day, which could report things on a cash basis and shuffle things from year to year. And that was one of the ways in which the Muldoon government was able to hide the fact that New Zealand's government finances were in such a parlous state that government debt was heading up towards 80% of GDP, and an incredible $1.05 of every dollar in tax that was being collected was being spent on interest. Got close to $1.04 before subsequent governments, be they national or Labour-led, became fiscally responsible. And indeed, I think it's fair to say that since that time, since the 1980s and the reforms that were there around state sector performance and public finance reporting and management, since that time we haven't had a fiscally irresponsible government. We haven't. It's true, you know, the then Labour government got the finances under control. The following national government reduced government debt. The following Labour government, led by Helen Clark with the Honourable Michael Cullen, Sir Michael Cullen now, reduced government debt from gross government debt from 38% of GDP to 18% of GDP and reduced net government debt to zero. And I'm going to dwell on that point a little bit because it is relevant to the Public Finance Amendment Bill number 2, because we hear time and again the diatribe from the other side of the House asserting that they inherited a decade of deficits and that the prior government was fiscally irresponsible. It's not true. Indeed, the budget surpluses that were run by the last Labour government, one year was 6% of GDP and in another couple of years were 5% of GDP or thereabouts. We ran 9 surpluses in a row, and that enabled us to reduce debt in the way that I've previously described. Every one of those budget surpluses was opposed by the National Party, whether it was John Kears, their finance spokesperson, whether it was Don Brash in charge, or John Key in charge, or Bill English in charge. Every one of them was opposed. And I remember sitting in this House when the government, the opposition National Party as they were then, were shouting out that the government was overtaxing, that they should have been refunding those taxes and having smaller surpluses. And of course, if New Zealand had made that mistake, if in the time of plenty we had not run surpluses and reduced government debt, the circumstance of New Zealand in the last 5 years since the recession and the global financial crisis would have been so much more difficult to cope with, because the government, and it now as a national government, would have had to cope with not just declining revenues but high levels of government debt relative to where they are. And as a consequence, they would have had far more difficult decisions as to whether they needed to be more austere in their government spending than they have had to be in order to get government debt under control. As it is, New Zealand has been able to run one of the least austere responses to the global financial crisis in the Western world, and as a consequence we haven't forced our economy into the deflationary spiral that has been experienced in so many other countries around the world. And that's quite right, and a major part of that has been the fact that the last Labor government prudently managed the government's finances in a way that reduced government debt despite the opposition of the then National Party. And on that front, it's interesting, the Public Finance Amendment Bill, these things are important, but leadership's more important. We again hear the government accusing the Labor government of financial mismanagement, and this week the Minister of Finance had the audacity to allege in respect of mistakes in budget reporting now alleged to have been made by National around the funding of the solid energy bailout, that they were cleaning up the mess left by Labor. When on questioning yesterday in the House, he was forced to admit that at the time they took over, that company had $15 million of debt or thereabouts, and low tens of millions of dollars of debt, and by the time it was in the crap 3 or 4 years later, it had close to $300 million of debt because of the ridiculous expansion plans into coal, lignite and other foolish measures that were which were promoted by the government, including the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, at the same time where they told the SOE to take on more debt, pay higher dividends, and in the end, of course, it all turned to custard for them. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn to a couple of particular measures in the bill that have been changed in its course. I'm talking now in respect to the State Sector Amendment Bill. All parties agree, as I understand it across the House, that where an employee in the state sector stops a job one day and gets an identical job the next day close to the same place on the same paying conditions, then they shouldn't be able to pick up redundancy from the old job and move into the new job because they haven't effectively suffered a detriment that would justify that. This legislation, when it came to the first reading in the House, went a lot further than that and effectively meant that people could have faced the risk that even though they had redundancy and other provisions in their employment agreement or employment contract, whether it was a collective or an individual agreement, those provisions would not kick in, despite the fact that they'd be forced to move to a job that they didn't want, that could have been distant physically and could have been quite different to the job that they previously had. And we in the Labor Party thought that was wrong. We agreed with the PSA that was just unfair. It wasn't the way in which a private sector employee would be dealt with in respect of similar provisions in their contracts if they were moving from one job to another, and we didn't think it should apply in the state sector either. And so we advocated hard, as did lots of other people behind the scene, and the government moved on that, and now we've got a provision in that respect that we can live with. And that's why one of the reasons why we're able to now support the bill. I want to say something about the whole of government directives the directives that could originally have been given under the bill as it came to select committee. They were said to be orders. They sounded like statutory regulations, even though the jurisdiction of the Regulations Review Committee was ousted. And the wording of the provision of the bill was so broad that, in our opinion, the government could have effectively imposed a wage freeze across the public sector through a piece of subsidiary legislation. And some of us are old enough to remember that it was a prior national government that did that under Muldoon, imposing a wage and price freeze on New Zealand, which was both unfair, didn't work, and made worse problems that there were then in the economy. So we again fought that, said that we wouldn't support that. That has been changed. The wording's been changed. The breadth of the directives has been changed to make it clear that they can't ride across good faith negotiations, and therefore you can't have a directive across government that is tantamount to a wage freeze. And that provision in its modified form finds our support too. So, Mr. Speaker, one final point. These changes are all well and good, but I don't accept the proposition that you can't have whole-of-government cooperation and get out of silos without these changes to the law. These changes to the law might make it a little easier, but what you need is leadership. You need leadership at a ministerial level, at a departmental level, at a state services level. And if you get that sort of leadership, you can achieve change across the public service. It's not about... What about foreign affairs? Oh, well, they eviscerated. Well, it was a mix of two words. I don't have time to talk about foreign affairs. Perhaps the honourable member can take a call.
John Hayes.